There's no one single coverage criteria that applies across the board. Like many other categories of treatment, it really is up to the individual insurer, as well as whether it's commercial, Medicaid, Medicare, plan through the exchanges. So coverage does vary from one to the next. I would say that one thing that would be common among almost all of those would be the fact that the coverage would focus only on FDA approved therapies. So that's kind of the threshold, making sure that the therapy is approved by FDA. And as we know, there are many unapproved therapies for menopause related symptoms that are widely used. For example, the so-called bioidentical hormones. But in most cases, those would not be covered because they are not FDA approved. And then beyond that, once you look at FDA approved therapy, certainly there's placement on the formulary, and that may vary one to the next. You may have some therapies that require prior authorization for the patient to be able to access those. And again, the focus there is on making sure that the patient has perhaps tried some of the more established therapies before moving on to the newer therapies, which are frequently more costly. So making sure, again, that we're stewarding our healthcare resources, but at the same time focusing specifically on the clinical needs of the patient. And that leads to a lot of variations from one plan to the next. But I'm going to say, again, that's one more area where managed care pharmacy professionals really come in as the experts to help navigate all that, as well as help make the determinations. And then an important thing to think about, I mentioned the concept of prior authorization and formulary placement. And the way that happens is certainly looking at, first off, FDA approval as a threshold. Beyond that, clinical guidelines, to the extent that clinical guidelines are available, things that would be first line therapy would typically be covered with the lowest amount of patient cost sharing and the lowest amount of criteria to be put in place. And then beyond that, in some cases, clinical guidelines haven't caught up yet to the therapies that are on the market. And so managed care pharmacy professionals are looking constantly at what do the clinical trial data say about which patients would most likely benefit from this therapy. So there's a balance of clinical decision making and ensuring appropriate therapy, and then also looking at making sure that we try the more established therapies before moving on to something that might be costlier and less tried and true. When pharmacy benefit managers and plans are looking at coverage, they certainly take into account the special needs of the population. What are the patients that make up that population? What are their individual needs? And how do we make sure that those needs are met by making various therapies accessible and affordable? So I guess a good example that comes to mind is migraine treatment. Certainly not specifically a women's health issue, but much more predominant in women than in men. I think the number now is about 18% of women versus 6% of men suffer from migraines. And so that's an important issue. We all know it has significant clinical, quality of life, and economic implications for the population. So how do we make sure that the myriad therapies that are out there to effectively treat and in some cases prevent migraine are being used appropriately? And that's where those formulary decisions and those clinical guidelines by the medical specialty societies come into play, looking at what therapies should we try that are likely to be effective, and then if they're ineffective, what comes next. So really letting the clinical data be the guideline, and that in many cases helps close those disparities. Of course, we all know that affordability creates a disparity as well. We have come a long way with healthcare coverage, which healthcare coverage in many cases opens the door for healthcare access. And we don't want to take a step back on that, because having comprehensive healthcare coverage that includes a pharmaceutical benefit is, in our opinion, critically important.